Welcome everyone to Southern Cross University. This is actually one of our standard seminar series we have been running for the last few years. Obviously this is a very topical subject and we welcome Dr. Gavin Mudd here. Thank you, Gavin, and I look forward to hearing your talk.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's academic workloads, of course, are not exactly light. But before I start too much, I just want to quickly explain my background, because that hopefully will help you understand how I think and why I think. And they're both important questions, obviously. I'm an environmental engineer. I was one of the first graduates from RMIT back 20 years ago, or almost. So I pretty much put the environment first. And to me that's really, really important. If we have no environment, we have no community. If we have no community, we have no economy. That's my sustainability model, and that's my set of priorities. I don't shy from that. I don't try and hide that. I'm very proud of the fact that I put the environment first. So hopefully, what I want to try and do is use that and my knowledge, and I've done work with Indigenous communities in Australia, in PNG, in Africa, on either uranium mining or gold mining and other things. But my background is mixing groundwater science with environmental impact assessment, regulation, and things. So I've got a very unique perspective. So hopefully, hopefully people may learn something. Now I want to start because the first point I think I'd like to make about coal seam gas is this one. And a lot of times we get stuck into this debate that we're almost, certainly politically and economically, a lot of people are just saying we have to have CSG. And I want to take a step back from that and say, well, what are our future energy options? Should we just continue to keep digging, or drilling, as the case may be with CSG, or should we actually really be looking at actually what are more viable future energy systems? And for a lot of these things, for 20 odd years, these questions have never been an engineering problem, they've been a political and an economic problem. The technology exists to build baseload solar thermal, to build wind, to build energy efficiency, to do all of these things and still meet our standard of living, a reasonable standard of living without costing the planet. So I think that's the first point. We need to really step back and actually say, well, do we understand the risks of CSG versus, say, solar thermal? Do we understand the risk of CSG versus, say, tidal or other things like that? So that's the sort of questions I think we really should be starting from, rather than just going headlong into an industry without understanding the risks. And I think that to me is a really important starting point. So what I want to try and get through, and it's ambitious to try and sort of cram this into the time we have today, but we'll see how we go. I'll talk a bit about coal seam gas, some of the main environmental concerns, some of my experience in looking at what are the groundwater risks, what's the evidence. A lot of my work I don't base on hope, I don't base on belief or assumption. I try and base all of my work based on actual measured real data, not just an expectation that I think this will be fine. And if I had a dollar for every time that I predicted a problem at a mining company, either the uranium mine or something else, and 6 months, 5 years later, I'd be rich. So in that sense, when we're talking about coal seam gas, and in Victoria, I come from the brown coal state, so we always boast that we have some of the highest polluting power stations in the world in terms of our brown coal power stations. It's not exactly the #1 claim I'm proud of, but typically, being brown coal, we don't have coal seam gas. Some of that is starting to change. There's certainly exploration going on, but there's also communities that are saying no. So in that sense, in areas like New South Wales and Queensland and elsewhere around the world where there is, say, black coal, typically methane's been a problem. It's been a nuisance. It's something that causes a safety hazard, and it's something you've got to get out of the way. Of course, people have realised that gas is actually quite valuable, and the technology to get it out, whether it's for mine safety or whether it's for ventilation or for oil and gas drilling, a lot of that is all very similar. And so you can extract that gas either before coal mining, separately from deeper systems, all sorts of things. But there are some key differences between the way we think about coal seam gas and, say, conventional gas. And I'll try and go through this pretty quickly. Let's look at conventional gas first on the right here. Typically, you're looking at a very porous sort of, say, sandstone type reservoir. And often what I like to think of is the bag of marbles approach. And the gas or water and sometimes oil fills in all those gaps between the marbles, or i.e. the sand grains. And so typically when we're drilling into those, often these systems are under pressure, so when you're drilling into them, often you'll get a flow of oil or methane very strongly initially. That will then gradually decline as the field's depleted, and at some point you're producing more water than obviously you are in gas. And certainly in the Cooper Basin, Bass Strait and other areas, there's certainly very mature fields that have reached sort of the right-hand side of that graph there. If we're looking at coal seam gas, we're generally dealing with the gas being inside the coal, often trapped inside the cracks or the, the sort of cleats as they're called inside the coal, and so it's held very differently. Sometimes there's enough permeability or ability for gas and water to flow through that coal, and so the gas can flow quite straightforward. Other times there's a need to use things like hydraulic fracturing to crack open the coal a lot more in order to allow the water and gas to flow. But typically, because of that, that nature of the way that the gas is held inside the coal, you've got to start reducing the amount of water pressure first before you can start to get methane. And eventually at some point the amount of methane starts to deplete as you basically extract all the gas, and there won't be much water left either. And so quite different in the way they operate. That's sort of fairly high level, but hopefully that helps get to some of the thinking. Now this is just from the Asia Pacific LNG project up in Queensland, just from their website, but what I want to try and focus on is the arguments about where the impacts are, how they occur, and then from a scientific point of view, what we should be doing in terms of monitoring, what we should be doing in terms of regulation, and then try and filter that through in terms of the claims that are coming from people in Tara, in Dolby, in Pennsylvania, in Wyoming. Because on one hand, you've got people that say that we're drilling so deep, and you've got all these thick sort of layers in between the siltstone or shale or very low permeability materials where you can't get leakage and you can't get cross-contamination. It's not a problem. Why would anyone worry about that? And yet on the other hand, you've got people that are using groundwater or live next door to some of these bores that are complaining about quite severe health impacts and environmental impacts. So this is the sort of context, and these are conceptual, trying to actually take one pinpoint of a bore and extrapolate over many kilometres and then look at behaviour over decades on a system as large as, say the Great Artesian Basin and or the Sydney Basin and things like that. That's the sort of scale that we've got to translate from the data and the monitoring to actual what the impacts are or may not be. Another important little thing, this is the Walloon coal measures down the bottom here. That's the area that's being targeted for coal seam gas around Chinchilla and Dalby, and we've got the Condamine alluvium up here. And that's actually a very, very unique situation where you've got a very rich alluvial aquifer, or gravel aquifer. It's basically an old river channel, hence the Condamine alluvium, that basically sits over the top of the Walloon coal measures. And that's very, very different. Most of the time where industry is actually looking at is over here, where there is a significant distance and they do have these very thick layers in between. So a lot of these issues are going to be very site-specific, and they're going to vary depending on the geology, what other uses of groundwater are going on, and so on. And this is just looking at a typical appraisal well, as they're called. One of the big differences, I think, when you're looking at CSG versus, say, coal mining, especially in terms of the way that environmental assessments and regulation is done, is for a coal mine, you might go and do some drilling first, then you would apply for environmental assessment and approval for a commercial project, if that is forthcoming, and that's generally a pretty good bet in Australia. Of course, you then get commercial scale development. For CSG, in order to actually work out how much gas can flow with or without hydraulic fracturing, and i.e. is there enough gas, is it likely to flow enough, how much water do they have, what's the quality of that water, a lot of the work that is done normally at commercial scale has to be done at pilot scale first in order to answer a lot of those questions so a company can actually decide, is it viable economically? And then hopefully as part of that, they should be collecting data that helps them to understand environmental issues and social issues and so on as well. So a lot of that more invasive work is now done at the exploration stage, not just the commercial stage, and that's different. And I think some of the models that we've had for environmental assessment haven't really understood that. And so a lot of the concerns that are coming from communities are really concerns about what's going to be happening at the commercial stage, and yet the processes like this are happening at the exploration stage, and people feel like they should be having a say about this sort of stuff, and our system can't deal with that. That's certainly a big issue. Now, when people look at this, and there's photos like this all the time coming from the CSG industry saying, oh, but look at this, it's just things that's just like you see in farms all the time, where you've got tanks, you've got pumps, fine, but in a lot of ways, the real problem is actually not what you see on the surface. There are issues that really go right down below, and in parts of the world, they're going down to 2 kilometres or more. So it's really trying to say, it's not just actually what you see on the surface, it's actually what's happening to the entire system. And that's really got to be the focus. That's really the way we've got to look at the sort of questions we're asking, the way we're doing monitoring, and the way we're being transparent about what the data is really starting to show. So although people can use these sort of photos and say, well, oh look, they're just a really small area, yeah, but the area impacted by groundwater would be magnitudes more than just this little area of this surface infrastructure. So again, we're going to compare apples. We need to compare a Granny Smith apple with a Granny Smith apple. That's really important. Now these are the common concerns, and there's certainly not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the ones that are often the most common. But obviously land use, and I'm not one of these people that believes that you can have coexisting land uses. They are competing. Now some farmers are certainly happy to have CSG on their property, and that's great. A lot aren't. That's great too. That's called democracy. People should have that choice. If you look at places like the Hunter Valley now, I think you really have to question the value of this sort of policy of coexistence. There are real challenges in the compatibility of land use. Surface water issues. In New South Wales, there are issues about leaks into creeks. I've seen photos of drill rigs in Queensland that have been completely flooded in, even though the farmers said to the CSG company, don't drill there, it'll flood. CSG said, we know what we're doing, it'll never flood, and of course 6 months later it floods, because it's Queensland, it floods every summer. The question is a matter of how bad. The groundwater impacts, and of course that's my own bias, because I did my PhD on looking at groundwater impacts, but there's two halves to the groundwater equation. Not just the water levels, like how much water is there in terms of the quantity of groundwater. The other issue obviously is the quality of that water. Coming from Melbourne, we never understood groundwater. We just don't understand groundwater. We've never needed it. We've had very good catchments in our east and the mountains. We've had very good quality management of that through Melbourne Water and its predecessors. Go to places like Adelaide or Perth or Alice Springs or Birdsville or farmers in many parts of Australia, and they'll tell you how important groundwater is, because without it they wouldn't be there. Same with a lot of Indigenous mobs. You visit some of the springs in the Great Artesian Basin, they can tell you exactly what groundwater means from a social point of view and a cultural point of view. So whenever we're thinking about groundwater, we need to keep all of these sorts of issues in mind, and its quality, i.e. the chemistry and the water quality as well. So certainly when I've visited some of the Indigenous communities in parts of Australia, I always feel, in some ways very humble, because it's they know the value of groundwater. As a Melburnian, typically we haven't in the past. But the amount of toxic pollutants that are there as well, either stuff that might get released through the atmosphere, through either pipeline leaks or bore leaks, but also what goes on underground. As an engineer, I would never guarantee that everything works 100% perfectly all of the time. Something always goes wrong. It's a matter of how much, when, where, what the impacts are, and so on. All right, now sure, things might be 99.99% perfect, but 1 in 10,000 means you're going to have a problem. And I think if you start thinking of it in ways like that, when you're looking at whether it's the casing used in drilling and in the bores themselves, whether it's the technology used for water treatment, things can go wrong, and we need to allow for that, and that should be good engineering practice. And we do it in a whole range of other areas, whether it's car safety, buildings, etc. Now, when we're looking at that and the evidence around CSG, I think the data is actually pretty minimal. There's a lot of data that is held by companies and government, but it's not in the public realm. Now, I'll come back to that. Now, this is just looking at Queensland in terms of CSG, and we can see the sort of the brown line there. The PJ is just petajoules. So it's basically a measure of the amount of energy that's being produced by CSG, and of course the ML is a megalitre, so it's a million litres of water. And so we can see that there's been a very strong growth in both of those. And so for every petajoule of energy that we're producing with CSG, we're producing almost 100 million litres of water. That water has a degree of salts in it, a degree of heavy metals and other stuff, often organics and so on as well. And we need to understand that. As an engineer, I can't manage water unless I know what I'm managing. So I need data in order to inform myself on that. This is just one of the ponds. Now, historically, these ponds were called evaporation ponds, and sometimes they were causing salt storms, so now they're called holding ponds or water ponds. I can play word semantics if I really want to, but the infrastructure is large, and this is not just runoff water or water that is equivalent to the water that might go down the Condamine River naturally. This is water that does have salts, it does have a whole bunch of other stuff in it, so it does need to be managed differently. Right, and hence these days, a lot of the newer projects are now going to water treatment. Right. Now, one of the things with groundwater, and there's people in this audience who've worked in groundwater, who use groundwater, and it's not exactly an easy resource to get your head around. You've got to take bits of data in areas, extrapolate over large areas, take bits of data over time and extrapolate over long periods of time. And Australia's track record is actually pretty bad. Look at what we've done to the Great Artesian Basin, look at all the dry land and irrigation salinity problems we've got in the Murray-Darling. And that actually pales into insignificance compared to the issues in the wheat belt in Western Australia, where the problem's much, much bigger. You know, we haven't understood groundwater and the fact that some of the processes going on in groundwater take decades. They don't just go in 1 year, they don't just go in 5 years. Sometimes they take 50 years or more before we realise the problem we've got. My mum actually grew up in northern Victoria, around Pyramid Hill. And once all the salt water, the salty groundwater moved into the clays in terms of the plains there, they have got a hell of a problem. And it's really hard to reverse. Right, so in that sense, if we're looking at CSG, we've got obviously the flow regimes, so the relative water pressures between different layers, and so that drives the direction of groundwater flow, especially when we're taking water out of the deep systems and that interaction with the shallow system, i.e. the condamine. Obviously the poor quality. The last thing we want to be drinking is contaminated water, right? Or more salty water. It doesn't necessarily mean we are afraid of salty water. A lot of people go down the beach and jump in salt water all the time. A lot of these things are always about context. And a lot of areas, say where there used to be fresh groundwater, we want to make sure it stays fresh. We don't want to take risks about any sort of potential impacts into the future. There are issues around methane buildup. And it's been quite bemusing in a way this year, looking at when we've had the big episodes of gas bubbling up in the Condamine River and the gas coming up through an old coal exploration bore around the Dalby Chinchilla area. There's clear evidence that these things can happen. And it's not just there, it's similar stories in America, and things, the famous Gasland sort of scenario where someone's actually lighting their drinking water alight. These things can happen, and the science is only just starting to catch up on these problems. And the other thing, if you've got no other source of water, and as a Melburnian, of course, we can just turn on the tap and get water from the catchment, or now a desal plant, which has cost an enormous amount, but we're not dependent on groundwater, but a lot of rural communities and farms and other things around Australia are. And so in that sense, we need to recognise that. Now this is, just want to walk through this quickly. The Camden Coal Seam Gas Project, I did a project for the Hunter Valley Protection Alliance a few years ago looking at CSG and the regulation and what are the risks and where's the data, where's the evidence. So I looked at AGL, and I'll give AGL credit, their annual environmental monitoring reports are online. It's actually more than most CSG companies do. Not even a lot of mining companies do that. So I think that's actually good public practice. It's transparency. So within that, let's look at the evidence. These are the only two paragraphs in their 2006 and 7 annual environmental report. Right? And you can see the sort of line that stands out. Well, we don't think there's a big problem because it's not significant. All right? And so when I pointed out that they've got no groundwater bores, so therefore they have no data, they can't claim there's no impact. If you've got no data, you can't claim impact. You can't claim no impact. You have no data. Simple as that. So I pointed that out, and AGL burred up and said, oh, but we meet all of our statutory obligations. I said, well, I didn't say you weren't. That really shows that there's a real problem in regulation. You're a gas company. It's easy for you to go and drill bores and actually get some graduate students or some consultants to go out, take some samples and measurements quite regularly, and actually get good data to prove there is no impact. Now, in sustainability and environmental management, that's the basic operational principles that we often call the precautionary principle. We want good data to prove there's no impact. Without that, we often have to assume there is impact, and that's a more conservative approach to management. So we point this out, and I thought, well, maybe they've actually learnt their lesson. So I went and actually looked at their 2010-11 annual report. The paragraph's a bit longer, but it's still got the same basic statement. No problem. And it's the old adage. No data, so there's no problem. Now, I think from a scientific point of view, you need good data to prove there's no problem. That should be good scientific, approach. That should be good policy or good regulation. Now, I could make analogies that all the subprime loans that were done in America, there was no regulation, there was no monitoring, so there was no data, therefore no problem. And by hell do we know where that's got us. Same when we look at insurance in Australia and a whole bunch of other areas. We need good data, whether it's in finance, whether it's in environmental, whether it's in safety, a whole bunch of things. We need good data to actually underpin a good understanding of the problems. Now, talk through these graphs, because certainly I think these graphs could easily be misunderstood. This is from a student project last year that actually looked at, well, what is some of the data that's starting to become available, and there's still a vast amount that is hidden, that is not public yet, but it's starting to come out so people can actually look at the data and make up their own minds. Now, if we look at the top graph, this is the Dandine CSG field near the Condamine. We can see data going back to the late 60s, so water coming down, then back up, and then coming back down again. And that may be drought related, it may be flood related, maybe over extraction related. Now that sort of rise and fall in groundwater, that's not unusual, you see that all the time. You can also see in the 2000s, the mid-2000s, when the CSG field started up. And clearly, I think, that does suggest a degree of impact from CSG. How much impact is maybe debatable, and whether it's entirely CSG or also the fact that that coincides with some of the worst years of the drought. Maybe this small little blip in the rise at the right-hand side there, let's get the mouse, maybe that was related to some of the recent floods and wet conditions in Queensland again. But look at the magnitude of that drop. It's certainly bigger than anything historically. So in that sense, I certainly argue, and there's other reasons in terms of the reversal of the direction of flow between the Condamine. Normally you had higher water pressure in the Walloon coal measures than existed in groundwater in the Condamine. So water, basic law of nature, will flow from high pressure to low pressure. So it would flow from the Walloons into the Condamine. What I think we're now seeing, and this is certainly what my students showed, is the pressure gradients have reversed. The water level is now lower in the Walloon, thanks to coal seam gas, and possibly over-extraction by farmers too. We can't ignore that. But it's now lower than the water level in the Condamine. So now the Condamine is being drained instead of being recharged. So in that sense, there's a more complex story here that we need more data and more extensive monitoring. Otherwise, we can't really unpack all the different processes that are going on at the same time. And that's really important. Where we have multiple things happening at the same time, we need to have very good monitoring in place so that we can actually really distinguish these things and say, cause and effect. How much is CSG? How much is farmers? How much is drought? All of these types of really important scientific questions. If we look at the bottom graph, this is also in the sort of similar area, the Tipton Westfield. People look at this graph and say, well, CSG started in the mid-2000s again, and all the groundwater bores are still long-term decline. Clearly, there's no impact from CSG yet. And I say yet because we know, anyone who thinks about groundwater, it's a slow-moving system, it takes decades. The large-scale impacts that were caused either from over-extraction in the Great Artesian Basin, from extraction for groundwater, for ground coal mining in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, land clearing in terms of dry land salinity problems and so on, these processes take decades to work through. So in that sense, we can't just take a few years of data and then say that everything's going to be fine for centuries. And looking at some of the impact assessments that have done, for these, some of the bigger projects in this area, they haven't gone back and actually said, well, 10 years ago we predicted an impact of, let's say a 5 metre drawdown. Well, what's been the actual impact from some of these projects so far? And how does that actual impact compare to predicted impact? I don't think anyone's ever done that analysis yet. I've been trying, this is the closest I've been able to get to do that so far. So, i.e., when we're making impact predictions at the moment for these future projects, how accurate are they? How well informed are they by actual data as opposed to hope? Let's move forward a bit. Let's go a bit more international. Seeing as Barack Obama's just one, of course, we can, we all love the US at the moment. There was a Duke University study that tried to understand actually this lighting of the tap. Can we actually prove that that is causally related to shale gas operations, or is it natural? And so what they did is actually went and tested a whole range of bores in the shale gas areas around sort of Pennsylvania and New York. And what they're able to show is that the methane that is coming out of these shallow bores is clearly shale gas in origin. It's based on some isotopic testing and the fingerprinting you can do to show that the methane is clearly from the Marcellus shale. That's, and the letters that have come back into the journal, although there's certainly been, I think, one or two that have tried to say, but you didn't find any evidence of hydraulic fracturing chemicals in the water, so therefore can't be hydraulic fracturing, therefore your whole argument's wrong. That still doesn't actually stop the realisation that the methane is clearly Marcellus shale in origin. The question of how it got there was not what they tried to answer. That's for future work. Certainly some of the letters come in and have said, yeah, well, clearly it shows that there's leaking bores. Maybe it's not hydraulic fracturing, and I actually think that's probably a correct interpretation. I think it's most likely to be leaking bores, i.e. there are examples where bores, the casing doesn't work properly. And again, not everything works perfectly all the time. So if we look at just a quick cross-section of the geology, just for a sense of scale, we can see where we're dealing with some of these shallow groundwater bores. So 500 metres. I'm always impressed when Americans use metres. The Marcellus shale right down the bottom is 1,500 metres depth, 1,500 metres relative. So you're talking about 2 kilometres depth. So in that sense, even though we're dealing and we're drilling so deep, and people say, but there's all these massive, low permeability systems in the way, therefore it can't leak and it can't be a problem and it can't happen. Well, that's good, it's based on theory, but it's not based on actual evidence. The actual evidence shows is methane is getting into these shallow systems. It's clearly getting up in here. If we look at the actual data, they actually then plotted it, the methane concentrations in groundwater, as a function of distance away from shale gas bores. And sure, we need to be careful. There's some bores that show no different concentrations to what you might find elsewhere in other bores, and methane can be produced naturally in groundwater, especially in areas like the Condamine where the farmers are actually drilling into the sandstones in between the coal layers. So there are examples of some of these things happening naturally, but certainly not on the scale that we're currently seeing in the Condamine, in that area. But look at this. There's certainly a bunch of bores that have much, much higher methane concentrations that you would have found before the shale gas industry went in. So where's the baseline data prior to the shale gas industry going in? And we go through all these big, expensive EIS processes, and some of these questions are still poorly addressed by the way the consultants and the companies put the reports together. And governments have not picked up on some of these basic scientific problems. Now, I'll talk through this. This is from the Queensland Water Commission, and this is a heavily modified version, so I'll quickly try and talk through this. We've got the Condamine alluvium in the middle here. It's a very good, productive aquifer, and farmers in that area certainly are very appreciative of it. We can see the balloon coal measures here. And you can see the various red lines there, where you can see the water level in the balloon due to CSG, so it's come down. Right, so there. What we can also see is the difference in water level. So initially it might have been relatively shallow due to over-extraction by farming, it come down. But what we're now seeing is instead of this water level being higher, it's now lower. And so I think, and this is certainly when I've provided some media commentary on this, within an hour of the Condamine gas bubbling going on YouTube, already Queensland government and industry were saying, no, can't be CSG. But we'll have an inquiry anyway. And I thought, well, yeah, so Humphrey Appleby would be very proud. What we need to be doing is basing it on good data. Now, when I was commenting, saying, well, I think there's a clear mechanism, it's a clear, obvious case that it could be explained by CSG. I emphasised could. And this is the sort of conceptual model that people in groundwater have to work with. We have to take bits of data, extrapolate over large areas, and think about processes that are going on. By reducing the pressure in the balloon, you're making it easier for gas to flow, and therefore easier for it to come up in the Condamine. And certainly the scale, and farmers I've talked to, and so on, there's no recorded history of an event like this in the Condamine. So it's unprecedented. You can't ignore that sort of comments coming from community. And I think that's really unfortunate that the industry and government are still doing that. And they just pretend it's just that people don't understand groundwater. It's like, well, I'd bet my house on farmers understanding groundwater much better than some of the hydrogeologists I've met. And I don't say that lightly. There's some hydrogeologists I have enormous time and respect for. But what that really means, in future, of course, there will be a greater emphasis on hydraulic fracturing. At the moment, it's relatively minor, so I certainly don't focus on that as much, because I think it's really what's happening to the groundwater resource that's the most critical questions. And that's the sort of stuff that we still haven't got good data. We still haven't got this good ability to really unpack the processes and look at these things and say, well, if we're going to be extrapolating an industry for the next 50 years or more, I'd want just more than a couple of years of data or just a bit of hope. But unfortunately, that's really not what's happening. I think they've just simply believed that, well, because we're deep, we're low permeability layers in between, nothing can go wrong. That's a really bad attitude, and that's almost a guaranteed recipe for problems. So when you're looking at the evidence and the claims that are coming out from communities in this region, in the Dolby Chinchilla region, in America, that should be raising serious scientific questions and the need for serious research and serious independence in the way that stuff is looked at. I think the track record on all of those fronts is pretty poor. So in that way, sure, CSG works, we can get gas out, but should we really be going down that path? Certainly I'm a great believer in renewables, and if the industry can demonstrate that the risks to groundwater are pretty minimal based on good data, then okay, fine, we can have that debate. But we still revolve a lot of issues around water and CSG. And also, I think one of the other arguments that's often raised, and I think Isaac and Damien will certainly be talking about this more next week, is the level of fugitive emissions. And in some ways, I've always said, well, I don't really get involved in that debate too much, because it's still, even if you assume the industry's right, and you can probably guess I don't necessarily assume that, but even if we assume the industry's right on the carbon footprint from coal seam gas as an electricity source, it's still 10 times too high for what we need in terms of long-term climate change mitigation. So I think in some ways, I just sidestep that and say, well, yes, we do need to understand fugitive emissions, but I think when we're comparing what we need to do for climate change, I think we should be taking an order of magnitude step further. Right, so in that sense, whether CSG is really going to muscle out renewable energy, that should be part of the debate, and it's hopefully that helps. We'll leave it there and open up for questions. Just thank a bunch of people, SCU obviously for the support for coming up for today, and leave people with a few different cartoons that I think help explain issues better than I can do. Thank you.